So you're thinking of composting? That's wonderful. We're so excited to have you on board. In this video, we're going to go over a variety of composting styles so you can explore which one or ones would work best for you. First, let us tell you a little bit about York Region Food Network.
The Compost Education Center, or CEC, is a project of York Region Food Network, or YRFN. YRFN prioritizes physical, mental, and environmental health and educates and advocates on food security. The CEC physical space will launch in spring of 2021, and until then, we'll be running bi-weekly workshops on composting and waste-free living, so stay tuned. So composting involves the breaking down of organic matter, so food scraps, leaves, dead plants, etc., into a nutrient-dense material called compost. Compost acts as a soil conditioner and natural fertilizer. The decomposition process is aided by animals, insects, detritivores, microorganisms such as bacteria and fungi, and a host of other natural organisms. Compost is not only amazing food for the plants and microorganisms in the soil, but also acts as a carbon sink and aids in water retention, and it helps plants to fight off diseases and pests.
When we take the food scraps and plant waste that we produce and intentionally provide them with the ideal conditions to turn into beneficial compost, we can 1. Improve the structure of our soils. Compost improves soil structure. It helps sandy soil retain more moisture and helps break up clay soils. It can make specific types of soil healthier. Compost can also help prevent erosion. 2. Increase the health of our plants. Microorganisms in compost help break down organic matter into plant-available nutrients so plant can grow stronger. Compost boosts the community of microorganisms and other creatures beneficial for enhancing nutrient uptake and fighting plant diseases. Adding compost to soil gives a natural, slow-release fertilizer to your plants. It's free organic fertilizing.
Compost also helps to clean up and repair contaminated soil, so soils that have been destroyed by prior pesticide use and damaged by mining activities. Compost reduces water use in agriculture, so when adding compost to the soil, it increases the amount of moisture that the soil retains, so you have to water less. Compost diverts waste from our landfills. As Annie Leonard of Greenpeace says, there's no such thing as away. When we throw anything away, it must go somewhere. So composting lowers greenhouse gas emissions. All the fruits and vegetable scraps, eggshells, coffee grounds, grass clippings, and fallen leaves that we compost in most styles are turned into something useful instead of being trucked off to the dump where they produce methane. Methane harms the atmosphere and adds to the main factors causing climate change. And as Mr. Rogers once said, often when you think you're at the end of something, you're at the beginning of something else.
So what's your why? What got you initially interested in the idea of composting? Is it to grow healthier plants in your garden? To save money on water or fertilizer? To create a better future for the next generation? We'd really like to know. Leave us a note in the chat box.
I know for myself, I started learning about composting while volunteering with Orlando Gomez at FoodShare with their mid-scale composting facility at their previous location. As someone who works with the land and grows food, composting is a natural step in the process of paying respect to the land and giving thanks. It feels similar to making a meal for people that I love. I'd really love to hear your story about why composting is important to you, so please do share with us in the chat box.
There are so many composting styles out there, and it can easily be overwhelming to figure out where to start. We'll be going over 7 different styles of composting to help you find the one that suits you best.
We also want to clarify that the styles of composting that we'll go over in this presentation aren't representative of all the different ways people compost. There are so many brilliant methods that our ancestors, elders, and community have used to care for the land and soil. We want to give thanks to those who have paved the path for us to be able to be here with you talking about various styles of composting.
Before we go into the composter styles, let's chat a moment about what we compost. This can actually vary based on the type of composter you have. but most composting follows these guidelines. The recommendation is to put equal parts brown material to green material. Brown materials are carbon-rich materials like dried leaves, wood chips, shredded paper or newspaper, cardboard, straw, and dried plants. Green materials are nitrogen-rich materials like vegetable and fruit scraps and grass clippings. There are some other components that can be added in small quantities, like eggshells and coffee grounds. Almost all composting styles that produce compost for garden use avoid meats, oils, bones, dairy, and animal waste. So let's get started with one of the most common backyard composters, the black bin composter. This is great for people who have a yard. The pros are that it's a popular style and easy to find. It's got an open bottom to allow for microbes, worms, and decomposers to help break down materials quickly. Why you might not choose this composter? The composter itself is not made of an environmentally friendly material. It needs a location with good drainage, which just means a flat surface where water doesn't collect. It does require labor-intensive work, such as turning and mixing with a shovel or fork. This might not be a good option for people who have had back issues or can't do any heavy lifting. The cost for this type of composter ranges from $50 to $200. And I'll just let Jess explain to you a little bit more about how it works.
The black bin composter is a single unit with a closed top and harvesting lid. There are a variety of different styles of this composter. It's made of black plastic for absorbing heat from the sun, and this composter is for households to discard their kitchen scraps. For the average family using it, it should usually take about 1 year to create finished compost. So this type of composter has an open bottom and requires a location with good drainage. So avoid areas that pool and collect water, and place the composter over a soil-based area rather than concrete. Just like we mentioned previously, make sure you add about equal amounts of browns and greens. So here you can see shredded paper, cardboard, wood chips, some dried leaves, and dried weeds that have no roots or seed heads. The greens are kitchen scraps in this bucket. So we have lettuce stems, celery stalks, kale stalks, things that we don't use in our cooking, but can also still be composted. We also have the stem of a cucumber, and we have tea bags here, and usually I break those open just to aid in decomposition, and then some coffee grounds as well. So you can add the greens at the same time as you add the browns, and what you want to do is try and get the pieces as small as possible so that you can increase the decomposition speed. Usually to turn the composter, you can use garden fork or shovel, and you'll want to try and make sure you get lots of air in there in order to get the decomposition process going. Here's what the composter looks like several months into adding food scraps, and this is a finished composter after a year. You can see lots of worms and microbial activity, so this will be good for spreading into your garden. And to harvest the compost, you open up the harvest lid at the bottom, and you can take a shovel and scrape out the finished compost, and then you can shut it back down and let the top part of the compost continue to decompose.
Next up, we have the 3-bin composter. This composter is great for people who have yard space, people who produce lots of food scraps weekly, so maybe a community garden or organization, a business with staff and volunteers, and there's slightly more attention and labor required here. The pros are that it allows for different piles of compost at various stages so that we can harvest finished compost without disrupting working piles. The cons? It requires turning and mixing with a shovel, which is quite labor intensive. It requires more space than most composters. It's quite a large unit. It needs a lot of food scraps regularly and can be quite costly to build. It does require planning and building. It's not generally sold as a unit. The cost for these types of composters can range from $200 to $700, But you can cut down on these costs by using reclaimed materials.
There are 3 sections to allow for 3 stages of compost. So stage 1 is where we add the green and brown materials to start the decomposition process. When the stage 1 bin is full, stage 2 is where the contents of the first bin get transferred, where it will rest. No additional materials will be added, but it will still be turned regularly, about once a week. The first bin can now be filled again with new materials. Once that bin fills up again, we transfer the contents of bin 2, the resting pile, into bin 3, where it will finish its composting process and be ready for use in the garden. Bin 1 gets transferred again to bin 2, and we start the process all over again.
And then we have the tumbler. The tumbler is good for people who have a backyard and is an option for folks who only have a small space to compost, like a balcony or porch. It's great for people who can't turn and mix compost with a shovel or fork, and for areas where there are ongoing critter issues. The pros are that tumblers take up very little space. They're easier to turn and mix depending on the design and quality of your tumbler, and they keep critters out generally, as it's a raised unit. There are models that have the option to be on wheels and can be rolled to different locations. Again, because they're raised, it makes them easier to empty out and harvest the finished compost. The cons is that they can be quite high in cost because it needs to be made of strong materials in order to hold the weight of the compost. It can get quite heavy and become a little bit more difficult to turn once it's full. Fluid from the unit needs to go somewhere. We usually have to have a drip tray that will need discarding. And moisture control of the browns and green ratio is more important to keep an eye on. There's less contact with beneficial microbes, worms, and decomposers, which are important for breaking down materials. So some people recommend that you add an accelerator to this style of composter, but that's not always necessary. The cost for these composters range from about $100 to $500.
There are actually a few different types of tumblers out there, but they are all fully sealed containers which can be rotated to mix the composting materials. The sealed container also helps contain the heat generated by the composting process, thereby speeding the process of converting kitchen and yard waste into compost. Compost tumblers were invented to make composting simpler and faster, depending on how well it's maintained. It is good for adding household kitchen scraps and brown materials, and the compost can be ready in roughly a year. The same rules of adding equal parts brown and greens apply here as well. As you can see here, there are food scraps in the bucket, and the food scrap can be added into the tumbler via a door that slides open on the body. You can see that this particular style of tumbler has some handholds which allow you to rotate the body. There are other styles out there that have a handle along the side that you can rotate in order to spin the tumbler. So to harvest the compost, place a bin underneath the opening, the same one that you use to put food scraps into. Typically the door can be slid open, and often there are drainage holes that can be found on most models, and a drainage pan is useful to place under to catch any excess fluid.
And then we have the BIODIGESTER. This is good for people who have a yard with a very sunny location and aren't looking to gain compost and just want to dispose of food scraps. The biggest pro is that the BIODIGESTER can take in materials not normally added to composters like meat, bones, and dairy items. And that decomposition happens rather quickly. The cons here are that this piece is generally needed to be placed 10 feet, which is 3 meters away from any veggie gardens because of the leaching of fluids. And also that no compost will be produced for actual use. The cost of this item ranges about $200.
So the green cone is good for a family of 4 or so. It's comprised of a lower basket installed below the ground, which forms the base for an above-ground, double-walled solar chamber with an access lid. The green cone stands 26 inches above ground level and extends about 18 inches below ground level. and there's a small lid at the top. The design of the green cone uses solar heating to facilitate and accelerate the aerobic decomposition process within the digestion basket, and therefore the system should be installed to obtain the maximum sunlight in your backyard. So food waste can go into the green cone digester, and it will digest approximately 5 kilograms or 11 pounds of food waste a week, which is over 25% greater than that produced by the average household. The unit accepts all cooked and uncooked food wastes, including meats, bones, dairy, and the food waste is converted into water, carbon dioxide, and a small amount of residue without the need for mixing or turning the waste. In a well-operating system, the residue will occupy the bottom 10 inches of the digestion basket after the decomposition of about a ton of food waste. After about 5 years, this small quantity of residue must be removed and dug into the garden subsoil.
And then we have vermicompost. This is one of my favorites. This is good for people who live in apartments and don't have backyards, for those who want to compost indoors, and those who produce very little food scraps each week. The pros here are that it's done indoors in a controlled environment. Great for winter composting. It's quite a quick process from putting the kitchen scraps in to getting the compost out. It takes up very little space and can be scaled up to create more bins relatively quickly. The compost created is extremely high quality. The cons is worms are more sensitive to what materials are added to their bin. It does require more attention and monitoring to ensure conditions are good. It doesn't take in as much food scraps as other methods, and not a lot of compost is created. What is created is not for broad distribution in garden beds, but may be better for seedling trays or transplanting seedlings. Harvesting here is pretty time consuming, but I would say it's kind of meditative. The cost ranges from about $10 to $200. Jess is going to give you a little bit more of an in-depth look at this style.
So building and setting up your vermicompost bin, you start off by filling a Rubbermaid bin halfway up with shredded paper. And this will be the bedding material for the worms, and they'll also break it down over time. The worms need a moist environment, so spread water evenly over the shredded paper until you get the consistency of a wrung-out sponge. And now you're ready to add your worms. It's also beneficial sometimes, but not necessary, to add a bit of worm castings from an ongoing bin or previous bin to bring in the microbiology and kickstart the decomposition process. And next, we can feed the worms. They'll eat most veggies and some fruits. So some things to avoid, though, are putting in spicy or acidic foods, onions, garlic, and definitely avoid adding meat, dairy, or fatty foods. I like to bury the food scraps under the bedding, but the worms will honestly eat the food wherever it is placed. At the beginning, you can add some crushed up eggshells to help the worms with breaking down the food in their stomachs. Lastly, remember to provide aeration to the bin. Here we are, drilling several holes into the lid of the bin to allow the worms to breathe. Fun fact, did you know worms actually breathe through their skin? And that's why they're so sensitive to moisture levels and the types of foods that we add to the bin. And here's what the bin looks like put together. Worm castings, which are a nutrient-dense material that worms produce from the food, can be harvested as early as 6 months. We use the dump and sort method here, where piles are made, and as the worms burrow further down away from the sunlight, we sort out the worm castings at the very top. The worms can then be placed back into a fresh bin to start the process again. Vermicompost bins can be purchased or made from materials at a very low cost. It's engaging for children, and it could be a fun family project. It requires a little bit of assembly and definitely requires some monitoring and maintenance. It's used correctly by adding brown and green materials. And it can produce quick and high quality compost indoors. Food scraps are added about each week or 2 weeks. The moisture level is controlled by adding water or food scraps if the bin is too dry, or dry paper materials to soak up excess moisture.
So here are some of the most common questions around vermicomposting. Where do you keep vermicomposters?
Many people keep the bins under their sinks. I keep mine in the basement, out of the way, because it's nice and dark and that's what the worms like. In general, the bins can be kept in a dark location, and ideally worms like temperatures ranging from 12 to 24 degrees Celsius.
All right. And can the bins go outside?
We wouldn't recommend this because temperatures vary so much outside. It's hard to maintain a temperature that the worms will actually be comfortable in. So I'd keep them indoors.
Right. And how often do you feed them and how much?
So I feed them weekly or bi-weekly, and worms will eat half their weight in food per day. But what I usually do is I add a handful of food scraps and check the bin again in a week. If all the food scraps are gone, I know I can add a little bit more. If scraps are still there, then I know to wait it out. It just takes some monitoring and practice.
Right. Also, can worms get out of the bin?
It's not common for worms to get out of the bin. They really can't survive outside the bin, so they generally won't leave.
That's good to know. Lastly, does it smell?
When maintained properly, it shouldn't be an issue.
Awesome. Next up, we've got hugelkultur. Hugelkultur is great for people who have a yard or garden and have access to logs, branches, leaves, and other natural materials. The pros are that it combines decomposition with food production and retains moisture for plants to draw from over many years. The cons? It's quite labor intensive to start and requires large logs. It doesn't produce any compost for spreading. The decomposition process happens under the bed and stays put. The cost? Free.
You can see here in the picture, there are logs, branches, dead plants, dried leaves, straw, and soil, and they're piled in a row with the largest materials at the bottom and smallest materials at the top to create a raised bed. So food is grown on the pile, and it draws nutrients on the slowly decomposing parts. These beds actually have good water retention due to the different components.
And lastly, we're going to talk about trench composting. This is good for people who have a large yard or garden and don't want to have to maintain a compost pile or bin and have lots of food scraps. The pros, it's inexpensive, totally free. Once it's created, it doesn't require any further maintenance. The cons, it's labor intensive at the beginning. It takes time to dig the trench and effort.
A 1 foot to 1.5 foot trench is dug, and food scraps are placed directly into the trench. It's then covered with soil, and decomposition happens below ground, so food can be grown on top. Fall is actually a perfect time to start the trench bed. By springtime, the beds will be ready to plant in.
Composting isn't an exacting science. It happens naturally in our backyard heaps. While maintaining ideal temperatures in a bin or pile takes some attention, the problems that arise when making compost are few and the solutions are many. You can check out yrfn.ca Compost Education Center for more troubleshooting tips and resources, and our YouTube channel, which will be updated with new videos regularly.